Hewson, someone who's been involved for a very long time in the BTO. 57 reports, I think, that you've been involved in either writing or co-writing with the BTO. So yes, somebody who's a, what's the right word, a leviathan? No, a something. There's going to be a word there for you. Stalwart, there we go. And you can see how long he's been at the BTO. This is the brilliant thing about the internet these days. You can chart people's hairstyles over time. As you can tell, I'm in the Chris Hewson middle period at present. Now, in all of those reports, probably early on in your career, there was a lot about squirrels, wasn't there? You were a squirrel man. And when I said to my squirrels in my garden today that Squirrel Man was coming, you ought to have seen their reaction. But I said, don't worry, Chris has moved on from squirrels, so they immediately relaxed. $375 you can buy this for. Really, truly, this is where the internet is weird, isn't it? But you have to pay $450 for that one. But as I say, Chris has moved on from squirrels. He's very much Cuckoo Man now. We're going to hear a lot about cuckoos now. This is one of the early tracking devices that Chris used. The cuckoos couldn't get off the ground with it, so they knew they needed to make some changes and remove some of the wooden aspects of it, and we'll hear about that shortly. Chris, I'm going to need to switch over to a different format, but ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chris Hewson.
Okay, so hello everybody. As you can see, the title of my talk is the BTO Cuckoo Tracking Project, what we've learned and where we're heading. Go with that one. Okay, so it's the BTO Cuckoo Tracking Project, what we've learned and where we're heading. And I'll start by giving you a little bit of background as to why we're doing this work in the first place, in the form of this graph here, which shows the population changes of migratory species according to BBS. And you can see we've got bars going off to the right showing population increases, and we've got bars going off to the left showing population declines. And the first thing to notice is that we've got a number of substantial bars going off to the left showing the recent population declines of some of our most popular and iconic migratory species. And this includes the nightingale, the iconic harbinger, the nightingale, the bird that's famed for the quality of its song in poetry and literature, which has declined by 90% in the last 55 years. And it's still declining with a 39% decline in the last quarter of a century. Next we have the swift, fantastic aerial species that might be flying constantly for 9 or 10 months of the year before coming back to nests often in the roofs of our houses. And that's declined by 66% in 27 years. So we've lost two-thirds of the birds in just over a quarter of a century. And that's the same for the UK overall, and specifically for England. And next we have the spotted flycatcher, perhaps a little bit less known to the general public than those last two birds, but nonetheless very popular on account of its behaviour, including its flycatching and its habit of nesting in our gardens, on sheds, and even on our houses. And that's undergone a massive 93% in the last 55 years over the whole of the UK. And we've lost two-thirds, roughly, in the last quarter of a century, so still in steep decline. And then finally, coming on to the topic of this talk, the cuckoo, the iconic harbinger of spring, rather than the nightingale. And that's declined by 78% in the last 55 years for England. We don't have a long-term trend that long for this species across the whole of the UK, but we've lost just over a third in the last 27 years in the UK. But that masks some regional divergence. So we've got still a strong decline in England. We've lost three-quarters of the cuckoos that were here 27 years ago in England. But in the last 10 or 12 years, since we started our cuckoo tracking project, there's been a resurgence in Scotland with a 62% increase. So we go back to this graph and we colour in the bars according to where species spend the winter. You can see that the colours aren't evenly distributed across the graph, and that's because there's relationships between where species spend the winter and their recent population changes. So to go through the groups, we have, first of all, the northern winterers, so those are species which winter in North Africa and southern Europe, including the blackcap, which has undergone a big recent increase. We then have the humid zone species, so those which winter in the Sahel, just south of the Sahara, including yellow whitetail, wheatear, whitethroat and redstart. And then we have the humid zone species, so those are the species which winter in the humid tropics of West and Central Africa, and they include the wood warbler, spotted flycatcher, cuckoo, nightingale and the reed warbler. And then finally we've got the Southern African winterers, 3 species here, swift, hobby and swallow. So if we group together the population changes of the birds in each of these groups, we end up with a population trend map graph which looks something like this. You can see overall the recent population increases of northern winterers. You can see the population fluctuations of the arid zone winterers, constant population, stable populations of resident species, and then a slow decline in the southern African winterers, and a steeper and more sustained decline in the humid zone winterers. Now, understanding these graphs, these trends has been sort of a major part of BTO's work on migrants in recent years. Some of them are actually relatively straightforward to get some handle on. So this graph here shows the Sahel precipitation anomalies between 1900 and 2013. We've got bars going upwards, showing wet years, bars going down, showing dry years. And I'll draw your attention to 3 different main events. First one being a drought which started in the late 1960s. Then we've got a more severe and more sustained drought in the 1980s. And then finally in 2009, the wettest year since the droughts began. And if we superimpose the population changes of the arid zone species, you can see that there's quite a close correspondence. And that gives us quite good confidence that conditions in winter in the Sahel are having a strong impact, at least, on the population changes of these species. But it's been trying to understand the population declines in the southern and in particular the humid zone winterers, which has been a major focus of the BTO's work. And the common cuckoo is an excellent model species for this work for a number of reasons. And the first is that it's got a declining population in Britain. So as we've heard, there's also some regional divergence, which is actually proving to be useful in understanding what's going on in terms of the overall population decline. The second is it's the largest small nocturnal migrant, which means it's the first that we've been able to use satellite tracking technology on as that technology has become more and more miniaturised. And then thirdly, when we started this project, its migration was very poorly known. So we knew, or at least we thought we knew from ringing recoveries, that the birds left the UK in a southeasterly direction and headed towards Italy at the end of the breeding season. But beyond that, we knew very little about where they spent the winter. The only clue we had was this ringing recovery of a juvenile cuckoo ringing a pied wagtail's nest in Eton in 1928, which was recovered at the end of January in 1930 in Cameroon, having been taken by man for the pot. But it's the advent of new technology, specifically this 5-gram satellite tag from microwave telemetry, which has enabled us to basically revolutionise our understanding of cuckoo migration. So the tags are solar charged, solar rechargeable with a rechargeable battery. You can see the solar cells here, and they transmit signals for 10 hours at a time. They're very constant signals that the satellites pick up as they pass overhead, and the way the signal changes as that happens due to the Doppler effect allows the satellite system to estimate whereabouts on the Earth the tag is. The result of this is that we get unbiased information. There's no need to recapture to download any data, so we get data from all of the birds that are tagged, which means we get to find out not only where they go, but also where they die, which, as I hope to show you and demonstrate, is really important for understanding this population decline. And the result of all this is that we get close to real-time tracking across the entire annual cycle of all of the birds that we track. And these tracks have been able to put on the BTO's website in real time, allowing the general public to watch their migrations unfolding and see the research as it basically as it's happening. So to tag a cuckoo, first you've got to catch one. This shows their catching setup. As you've already seen, this famous old female stuffed cuckoo on a stick. And then underneath we have outside there sound lures playing the sounds of male and female cuckoos indulging in mating. And then hopefully you can see some mesh, and these lines here are mist nets, which we surround the lure system with a triangle of nets often, depending on the situation. And the idea is that the male cuckoos will see and hear our lures, they'll be so keen to get there, they'll fly in from a distance, not notice our nets, and fly straight into it. Sometimes that works not so well. The birds might sit on a nearby tree and simply call back at our lures, which can be very frustrating when you've got up at 2 in the morning. But sometimes it does work really well, as shown here, where you can see myself and 2 colleagues, Phil Atkinson from the BTO and Tony Cross, volunteering up, each with a cuckoo ready for tagging. So once we've caught the birds, as ever, the first thing we do is put a ring on their legs so they can be individually identified for the rest of their life, whether they've got the tag on or not. And then we begin the process of putting the tag on via a harness. And the first thing we do is put a head loop over the bird's head to place the tag on the bird's back between the wings. And then that head loop crosses over, and there's a loop to either side which goes from the bottom of the throat around the either side of the chest, and then joins up onto the back of the tag, as you can see here. We then have to spend some time getting the fit exactly right by integrating the harness underneath the bird's feathers so we know exactly what the fit is. It can't be too tight so it constrains the bird, it can't be too loose so it moves around, it has to be exactly symmetrical. You have to bear in mind that cuckoos are put on a lot of fat before they migrate as well. Eventually, when we're completely sure that we've got it exactly right, we reach the point of no return where we glue it all up, cut off the excess, and eventually we end up with something like this, which is a male cuckoo. I think this was David the cuckoo from the 2012 Welsh cohort, ready for release early in the morning. So this map shows the population changes of cuckoos according to BBS. You can see in the north and west we've got blue, showing recent population increases, and in the south and east we've got red, showing population declines. And it was against that background that in 2011 we tagged our first five birds in East Anglia for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it was close to the BTO HQ in Thetford, and also it's right in the heart of the declining zone that you can see there. And this map shows the southward migrations of those first 5 birds. And you can see that 3 of the birds did something which was expected on the basis of ringer recoveries, and that's that they went southeastwards and stopped over in an area of northern Italy called the Po watershed. And we've been able to show through the project that this is indeed, as suspected, a really important stopover for our birds on their way down into Africa. But as you can see represented by this orange and pale blue lines, 2 of the birds did something completely different, which was that they left the UK in the southwesterly direction, through Spain, and then entered Africa at the far western part of the continent. And then, to our surprise, they turned east and converged precisely on the routes of the other birds. And this was a complete surprise for 2 reasons. The first is we've never had a ringing recovery, not a single one west of where a bird had been previously caught. And secondly, that if birds take 2 different migration routes, you'd expect them to end up in different wintering grounds. And this is the first time that sort of pattern of birds taking 2 routes and ending up in the same place has ever been recorded. So over the next few years in the project, we tagged birds in a variety of locations across the UK, stratified by population trends, but also by latitude, the major upland, lowland habitat division, and you can see here that that includes a sample of birds, 3 birds tagged in Ashdown Forest here in Sussex, which were all funded by the Sussex Ornithological Society, I'm pleased to say. And this map shows the southward migrations of those first birds from the first few years. You can see in red we've got the migrations of birds which went southeast, stopping over mostly in Italy before going down into Africa. And then in yellow we've got the southwesterly birds that went almost entirely through Spain. So we had 23 journeys of 20 birds going southwest with Spain, 22 birds going southeast via Italy. And we found that there was a significant difference in survival up to arrival in tropical Africa of the birds of the 2 different groups. So the model estimates suggest that overall just over half of the birds which migrated via Spain made it to south of the Sahara, whereas almost all of the birds which migrated southeastwards via Italy did do over these years. So not only did the birds survive differently, but they're also distributed differently across the UK. And you can see that this graph here shows a pie chart for each of the, or this map shows a pie chart for each of the tagging locations, showing the proportions of birds which migrated southeast in red and southwest in yellow. And you can see in the uplands of Scotland and Wales, all of the birds migrated southeastwards by the more successful route via Italy. But across England, we had a mixture of the birds taking the two routes, except for in Sherwood Forest, where the initial sample all migrated southwest. And the background to this map shows the population changes of cuckoos between the last two breeding bird atlases. And we took a buffer around each tagging location and looked at the relationship between the migration routes and the population changes. And we found that there was a very close correspondence between the proportion of birds taking this less successful, more risky route via Spain and the degree of local population decline. And that applies if you look within upland and within lowland as well as overall. So we were pretty convinced that this mortality on the western route was at least contributing to the population declines that we've seen in the UK. Now this map shows the mortality locations across these first few years, and you can see in yellow on the western route that several of the birds, many of the birds, had actually died before they even initiated their Sahara crossing. And this was especially the case in the years where the droughts and wildfires, which sometimes occur, it's always dry at the end of the summer, but sometimes occur more severely in Spain. When they were particularly severe, none of the birds at all which migrated by Spain made it through. So we thought that actually this must be contributing, we think, towards the mortality that we see on the western route. But of course we also know that these western route birds come from the Midlands and the south of England. In other words, the areas of the UK where the habitat degradation in terms of the food supplies for cuckoos, the large hairy caterpillars that they prefer to eat, have been most severe. So we also wondered whether conditions in Britain are also contributing to that difference in survival. So in the next 10 years or so, we've been concentrating mostly on tagging birds from the part of the UK where both birds migrating by Spain and birds by Italy can be expected. And the idea of this is to look and see how survival of adults is affected by, firstly, the route-specific effective conditions in the UK. So our birds have taken each of the two routes affected differently by what's happening here, and to what extent are they affected. Secondly, looking at the conditions in southern Europe, so Spain or Italy, depending upon which route the bird takes. And then thirdly, the interaction between the conditions in southern Europe and the conditions in the UK. We're still collecting data towards that. It's a long process. We don't get to tag as many birds as we like per year. Ideally we do 20 or 30, but obviously we're limited by money, etc. However, in terms of understanding the relationship between these two different migration routes and the population decline, some recent work that we did with Claire Buchan from the University of East Anglia has proved really quite informative. So Claire, for a previous piece of work, created these four maps, which are basically, she called them maps of potential threat surfaces. So we've got the risk of direct mortality in the top left, so that's infrastructure, so things like risk of birds colliding with windows, as indeed one of the birds died in Dungeness, flying into the window near the bird observatory. Top right, we've got habitat change, and then at the bottom we've got breeding and non-breeding climate change. And what Claire did was she superimposed the tracks onto these threat surfaces, or vice versa, depending on how you want to look at it, to see what degree of potential threat each of the birds was taking. And then she then related it to the longitude of their southbound migration in relation to their potential threat exposure in tropical Africa. And what Claire found was that actually for all three potential threats, so direct exposure to mortality threat, habitat change and climate change, birds taking more westerly migration routes were exposed to a greater degree of potential threat in Africa. So it may well be that not just in Britain and in Europe, but actually across their whole annual cycle, these birds are exposed to riskier conditions which might lower their mortality. We're looking at that and we've got indicative results so far, but we need more data before we can be absolutely sure. In terms of how they get to Africa, the very first birds were immediately very informative and taught us completely new things that we've never even thought about. So Clement the Cuckoo on 15th of July, you can see here in the southwest of Algeria at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was 400 kilometres further on 7 hours later. Before this, it was thought that birds would only migrate over the Sahara Desert during the night because it was too hot during the day and they would land and find some shelter in the day. But of course, we've shown that the birds usually, not always, but usually continue over the desert in the day as well. The tags have a temperature sensor, and in fact the lowest temperatures that we ever record through the annual cycle are totally counterintuitively when the bird are flying over the Sahara Desert during the day. And the reason for that is because they're migrating at something, they rise to 5,000 or 6,000 metres, so 3.5, 4 miles up, to avoid being fried by the sun, they get into very cool air to offset that heating effect. So this map shows shows the southward migration of the birds against time, and you can see that they migrate rapidly over the Sahara Desert, very inhospitable, as you'd expect, and then they immediately stop in the arid zone for 2 to 4 months before moving on to their final winter destination. As I mentioned previously, that is in this area here, which is the same for both birds with both routes. It's in this area here, the western part of the Congo Basin in Central Africa. This area was considered to be not very likely or not very good place for migrant birds because it's not very highly seasonal, which means there's not huge, abundant seasonal surpluses of resources which migrant species can home in on and exploit because they're all supposed to be gobbled up by the resident species. But tracking work has shown that not only cuckoos, but also some of our British swifts. That's one of the first ones that I did with Doug Radford from Falmere in the old RAF building up on the aerodrome there. Ended up wintering around the edge of this area. Greg Conway and Ian Henderson's nightjars from Thetford Forest around the edges of this area. And then perhaps, to me anyway, most surprisingly of all, rescreened from the RSPB's corn crates, ended up here rather than in South East Africa as we all supposed beforehand. So clearly this is a much more important area for migrants than we hitherto thought. So homing in on where the cuckoos spent the winter within this area, 4 of the first 5 birds all ended up in this area here called the Teke Plateau. It's within the Congo rainforest, but it's actually, due to soil factors, savanna mostly, with forests only along the watercourses. And this is what it looks like, the photograph at the beginning of the wet season, photograph sent to me by Francois Dalzet-Lemaire. And you can see the grass is just beginning to grow up and then the forest along the watercourses. And the first thing that we thought was actually this looks pretty similar to some of the landscapes within the UK that we've taken cuckoos. So some of them at least seem to be tracking similar looking landscapes across the annual cycle. But that doesn't apply to all of the birds. One of these first 5 did something which is more typical of what birds have done in subsequent years, which is that he wintered in the western Congolian swamp forests. That was Chris the cuckoo, named after Chris Packham. And these are some of the wettest forests anywhere in the Congo. This is a picture of what it looks like in the dry season, sent to me by Hugo Rainey, who worked there for the WWF. And he told us that some of the specific area of habitat that Chris the cuckoo spent the winter in has got the highest densities of western lowland gorillas ever recorded within the UK. So certainly for me, it was a bit of an eye-opener to think that the cuckoos I hear outside my garden just south of Cambridge have been hanging out with gorillas during the winter. So if you look at Google Earth, you can see that actually the Congo rainforest is more or less still intact. It's been opened up a little bit for roads. There's been small-scale logging clearings, such as showing this photograph taken by Toby Smith, who went to Gabon, photographer, to chase cuckoos for the BTO. And these sorts of small-scale openings are actually probably beneficial for cuckoos because they seem to like forest and woodland edges quite a lot. So we don't think there's anything untoward going on in the Congo which is contributing to population decline. Obviously, that's yet. If you continue to log the Congo and clear it, eventually there won't be enough habitat for them. But certainly at the moment, we don't think this is the place to look for the causes of declines. Now, at the end of the winter, the birds all headed off in a northwesterly direction, and we lost our first cuckoo, quite amazingly, more or less in the same place in Cameroon at the same time of year, within a few days of when that 1930 ringing recovery was taken by man for the pot. Unfortunately, that was the one named Clement, after Andy Clements, who was the CEO of the BTO at the time. But even though that bird didn't survive, the other birds and the project did, and they all headed off to this stop over here in Ivory Coast in Ghana. And this is a really important area where they spend about a month in the spring fattening up, ready for their northward crossing of the Sahara. And this was immediately very interesting to us because the cuckoo is one of the species, like the swift, which also stops off in West Africa. We've discovered from our tracking work, which was completely unexpected. They've both got very strongly declining populations in recent years and have failed to advance their arrival date back to the UK in line with earlier springs, as most other species have done. And this is important because we know that the species which advance their arrival date back less in response to climate change and global warming have actually shown bigger population declines than those that have been able to adjust their arrival time. So we wanted to understand this more, and we asked two key questions. Firstly, why has the cuckoo not advanced its arrival back to the UK in line with earlier springs? So we know that some have and some haven't, but what's the difference between those species? What's causing that? And then secondly, what are the consequences of this throughout the annual cycle? So originally it was thought that the reason why these populations were declining was because of reductions in breeding success, because the birds weren't getting back early enough to exploit seasonal food resource fluctuations. But actually, the empirical evidence for that has been relatively limited. So we wanted to look throughout the annual cycle to see whether perhaps the birds are able to compensate what they suffer at other times. So to do that, we divided up the annual cycle of the cuckoos into six stages. And you can see at the top we've got the breeding grounds residency, and at the bottom we've got the midwinter residency. And on each of these maps you can see a dark green area for the Congo from the forest area. In orange we've got the Sahara, and then black dots show the locations of the birds during each stage. So we've got the breeding residency, followed by southbound migration over Europe and the Sahara, followed by migration through tropical Africa to the wintering grounds residency, migration through tropical Africa in the spring, and then migration over the Sahara and through Europe back to the annual cycle stages. And when you do that, you end up with something that looks like this. So you've got departure from the breeding grounds, completion of the southbound Sahara crossing, arrival at the wintering grounds, departure from the wintering grounds, departure from West Africa, and arrival to the breeding grounds. And what we did was we used some, I would call them exciting statistics, if you don't mind that phrase, but we looked at the relationship between the timing of these different events with each other and also arrival back to the breeding grounds. And what we found was quite striking in that despite its reputation as the harbinger of spring, bringing good weather and spring with it, we actually found that the overwhelming majority of the variation in when cuckoos get back here is determined by when they depart from West Africa. So actually events occurring 5,000 kilometres away are more important than weather closer to home in determining when spring in the form of the cuckoo gets back to you. And then equally surprisingly, I think, we found that when they complete the southbound Sahara crossing has quite a significant impact on when they leave for the northward Sahara crossing. So the speed at which they migrate through Europe or over the Sahara when they leave us after breeding actually also has a significant impact of when spring in the form of cuckoo gets back to us. And then finally we found that about a ninth of the variation was actually determined by the speed of migration through Europe, so there may be a little bit of truth in the old adage after all. So why should it be that departure from West Africa is so important in determining when they get back? Well, we think the answer lies in this thing called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ for short, which is shown on this map here as this purple line, with in dark blue and green the heavy rainfall associated with it. And I'm hoping I'm going to be able to get this to work. Okay, that'd be great. Sorry? If you just click on the actual map towards the bottom, that'll do, yeah, just click on that, I think. Brilliant, thank you. So as you can see, in the northern spring, the ITCZ moves up northwards and takes rainfall with it into West Africa. And then in the northern winter, it's receded and taken the rainfall into southern Africa. And then again, up into West Africa in the spring, bringing the rainfall with it. So departure from West Africa, just to summarise, departure from West Africa is the primary determinant of when they get back to us in the spring. And the timing of the rains there is determined by the movement of the ITCZ. And this is important because the ITCZ doesn't change its timing in relation to how warm it is here in the northern hemisphere or in the temperate regions. It's basically driven by the variations in solar radiation as the Earth on its tilted axis moves around the Sun, which means it's invariant, basically, with respect to global warming. And when these rains come, they produce a burst of insects which have been lying dormant during the dry season, so they've been estivated as the term, sort of like hibernation, which burst out. They all burst out as soon as the rains come, and then cuckoos and other birds can feast on those and fatten up to fuel their migrations northwards over the Sahara. Of course, the rains will also cause greening of the vegetation, which enables foliage-eating insects like caterpillars to become more abundant, but we think for our population and the timing relative to the rains, that's not so important as this huge bonanza of insects, things like termites, which come out when the rains arrive. The result of this, therefore, is that timing of rains determines food availability and therefore determines variation of stock quality over time, and that's how it's constraining arrival back to the UK. So the birds have to find enough food, they have to wait for the rains, it seems, for that. Now, to understand the consequences of this in more detail, we looked at the relationship between migratory timing and mortality risk. And to do that, we looked at the 3 annual cycle stages which follow the events which most importantly determine when the birds arrive back here in the UK. So after the completion of the southbound Sahara crossing, we have migration to tropical Africa's the wintering grounds. And then after departure from West Africa for the northward Sahara crossing, we have migration through Europe. And then after arrival back to the UK, we have the breeding grounds residency. And what we found was that across these 3 annual cycle stages, birds which migrated earlier were more likely to die. And our interpretation of this is that in order to try and get back here early enough, against everything which is going on, the birds are having to take more risks. So in other words, they might have to migrate with smaller fat reserves and just hope that conditions get them over there, because that will be outweighed by the benefits of getting back early enough and a more successful breeding season. In contrast, however, we found that after departure from the breeding grounds, so during the southbound migration over Europe and the Sahara, later birds were more apt to die. And this was particularly the case for birds from the lowlands. And our interpretation of this is, of course, this is the area where the food supplies for the cuckoos have become more degraded. So fewer caterpillars mean thinner cuckoos, mean taking longer to get into migratory condition, hence migrating later, and then a greater risk of them dying. So, yeah, more evidence that conditions here in the UK are likely to be important in determining the migrations, and also in Europe probably, in determining their migration success. So I'm going to sum up now what we've learnt, hopefully, about the causes of population decline. We saw that the mortality of birds using the autumn migration route via Spain is linked to population decline. We've seen that habitat loss during the midwinter doesn't seem to be critical yet, but of course if that continues unabated, that would be a problem, of course. And then we've seen that there's a constraint at the timing of spring migration in West Africa, which appears to increase mortality risk at various stages of the annual cycle, including, quite surprisingly, even during southbound migration. So I'm going to wrap up now by talking about our plans for, I said next year, so actually this year now, so we'll change that, and beyond. Firstly, we're going to do some more analysis looking at the impact of habitat quality as well as rainfall in relation to the timing of migration from West Africa. So I've said that the overwhelmingly important thing we think is rainfall patterns, which is true, but we know that there's been a lot of deforestation and loss of trees in that area, and it's possible that poorer habitat quality has prevented these birds from being buffered by the seasonal constraints of the ITCZ. And if we can ensure that there's better habitat for them, then perhaps they'll be able to cope better with that constraint. So we're going to be looking at that in more detail. We'll also be tagging, hopefully, a sample of new birds split between northwestern Scotland to help us understand more about the survival rates of birds from the areas where cuckoos are still doing well, in fact where they're increasing, and then in the south, in the area where we can expect to see 2 different birds taking 2 different routes, even from the same breeding location. We'll also be trialling some new GPS-level accuracy tags to be able to help us looking at ranging behaviour in the UK as well as elsewhere in the annual cycle. So the Doppler PTTs that we use are fantastic for looking at the migration of the birds across the global and annual scale, but they're only accurate to about 1 kilometre at best. So they're not very good for looking at ranging behaviour and use of specific habitat patches. This data from an archival GPS tag put on a nightingale shows you the sort of data you can get. This was in the eastern part of the fens. So this nightingale had a territory in the western part of this tree line here. And you can see this is the territory where the territory is, and the bird has made excursions further up the tree line and into the adjacent hedge into the territories of other birds. So that gives us an unprecedented level of information. And by doing that with the cuckoos, the idea is to understand the impact of habitat policy here in the UK and in Europe on subsequent survival and migratory performance. And the idea is to design habitat interventions to allow us to coin the phrase of the moment of use on curlews and black-tailed godwits, head start the cuckoos on their southbound migration. In other words, by increasing habitat policy, we hope to advance their migratory timing, put them under less timing stress, and then reduce levels of mortality that are seen throughout the annual cycle. And then finally, we'll be doing some more analysis of what we call the Global Cuckoo Migration Data Set, which is basically all the data that we and our colleagues, we've done in collaborations, or our colleagues have collected independently, from, mostly people from Copenhagen University, across the world. And I'd like to finish by showing you what I hope you'll agree is quite a stupendous map of all this data. And you can see that we've got in pink the clockwise migrations of most of the birds from Europe, including from upwards of Scotland, some birds from England. In pale blue, we've got the anti-clockwise migrations of the southwesterly migrating birds from the UK. In purple, we've got the out and back migrations of birds from European Russia and Siberia. And then, excitingly, in white, we have the Far Eastern cuckoos from Mongolia, China, Korea, and the Russian Far East, which migrate down through China, south of the Himalaya, into Italy, India, where they stop over before migrating over the Indian Ocean and down into southern Africa. And this group here includes birds which migrate from Kamchatka in the far Russian Far East, right down to Namibia, and that's the longest land bird migration which has ever been recorded. And we're working on a couple of papers looking at this now. In yellow, we've also got oriental cuckoos, which migrate from Siberia down into Australasia, as far south as northern Australia. And we're doing two papers. The first led by our colleagues in Copenhagen and Max Planck Institute, which is looking at the historical determinants of current migration patterns, using genetics, and also hindcasting of the climatic scenarios right back for, I think it goes back now to 900,000 years ago. And that shows us exactly why we think that oriental common cuckoos are speciated. It looks like they might have been one species some time ago, and then the conditions were suitable for a resident species to evolve, which eventually became the oriental cuckoo, which looks very similar, but sounds very different. And then we, the BTO, are leading on a project looking at the ecological determinants of these patterns. So looking at how do they manage to migrate so far, for instance, and the amount of resources that they're able to accumulate on these very long migrations, and also the timing of where they migrate to relative to the timing of breeding, because some of these birds here will still be on their way to arrive in Kamchatka when some of our birds here have already left on the autumn migration. So I just want to finish by saying thank you very much to all of you for listening, and thanks very much to all of these different people. There's probably people I've missed off, and for which I apologise. I can see that I've missed off particularly amongst the Cuckoo sponsors and champions. I wanted to say that includes the Sussex Ornithological Society, who funded the 3 birds that we tagged in Ashdown Forest. So yeah, thanks to all these people. Thanks to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we have got a little bit of time for questions, and I'm going to imagine that there will be questions on an amazing subject that is opening up new horizons. Tim, go first. So the question is, the loss of insects in the UK, is that also affecting productivity and hence survival?
Yeah, so we don't know exactly, but there's some work done by Chloe Dennerly and colleagues at the RSPB, like her PhD, which did look at a little bit of this. Obviously, we don't think that host availability, there's no evidence that host availability is driving cuckoo declines. So that's partly because the areas where they're declining most, the most common host is reed warblers, which is increasing, and that's a very late breeding bird. So we don't think that, for instance, ill parasitizing dunnocks, they might be arriving back too late. So we don't think that's the main thing. In terms of food supplies for the adult cuckoos, that could well be limiting. We haven't tracked female cuckoos yet, but when we've got these smaller GPS tags, we do wish to do that. Partly to look at the range of behaviour of the females, which might give us some insight into that. But it's possible that if the females can't find enough food, they might be constrained on the number of eggs that they can lay, for instance. So yeah, it is possible. We don't really know the answer to that, but I'm sure that conditions in the UK are important as well as conditions elsewhere in the animal cycle. It's about understanding the balance. We've got lots of analysis results which are supporting that. So conditions in the UK definitely. I mean, there are other species which have that same pattern of population decline. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment is getting tracking data from Scotland to compare with tracking data for England to see whether there might be any differences in migration. And overall, we're not seeing that with the possibility with garden warblers, but we need more data. So we've really started tracking that. So that's not a very clear answer, that's because I don't have one, but I'm sure that food availability for adult cuckoos is impacting them here as well as elsewhere. Hosts, less so. I don't think the food for the hosts to then feed to the chicks is a big problem.
Any more questions for Chris? Yeah, Ken.
So the difference in survival rates between the West and the East is so big that you wonder evolutionarily how that's been maintained.
Yeah.
So is it possible to think sort of temperature changes?
So I'll just repeat the question for the room. So the difference in survival between East and West seems so huge. How can that be, basically?
Yeah, so basically what I showed up there, 57% versus 97%, is the modelled estimate. So it wasn't like the estimate if you just look at the data, it's what the model says if you control for all the various factors. So it's not just the observed data. Secondly, I would say that the year after we published this paper, for the first time there was a drought in Italy, and we saw birds dying, and we saw birds doing weird things like shooting off to Poland and shooting off to southern Italy, etc. So, which is interesting because it shows us that drought in southern Europe is indeed important, but it suggests probably that the difference in survival between them isn't as big as is shown there. For the timing paper, we did get estimates of survival for migration routes, as well as for upland and lowland, and we find that both of those are important. So there's a difference between upland and lowland irrespective of route, and then a difference on route on top of that. Not only that, but we actually found that occurs over most of the annual cycle stages, the difference in routes, not the difference for the habitat, the difference in route does, which isn't surprising because birds are in different places. So I don't know the answer, and I'm intrigued by that as well. One of the things that I have hypothesised, it might be rubbish, but it might be some truth in it, I quite like the idea of it, is that we know that the southwesterly migrating cuckoos are in the part of the UK where reed warbler is a main host. And reed warbler has obviously increased as a host, and it could be that we don't know, genetically it hasn't been shown yet, so I'm slightly doubting this hypothesis now, but we haven't got any direct evidence of it. But I wonder whether if the migration route to the southwest is linked to the hosts, so more likely to occur in reed warblers, as it geographically appears to be the case, then you could have an evolutionary trap where, because of the timing advancement due to warming springs, dunnocks and melopippids become less available because they're breeding earlier. They have to, only the cuckoos which exploit reed warblers can persist in southern England, and that's linked to the southwestern route. So although this change in host occurs, it's suboptimal and drives the decline. So like an ecological trap, but an evolutionary one. You see, I like the idea of it, but I've no idea whether it's true. So.
Chance for one final question. Janet.
I think it varies a lot, and probably in relation to food resource supplies.
The question there is, how many eggs do cuckoos lay each year?
Yeah, so it varies a lot, and possibly food supplies is important in that, which would, in answer to the gentleman to your left question. But it can be, it's been recorded over 30 or 40 even for a female. I suspect in general it's much less than that. And it would be really nice, I don't see how we would know, but it would be really nice to know whether that's declined over the years or even how that varies depending upon weather conditions. So, basically these cuckoos come from tropical rainforests. When we tag them, we actually notice that often they've got a little bit of secondary growth of feathers on the breast here. So I view this as like a polar exploration trip for these cuckoos. They don't like it. And when it's cold and wet, they like it even less. So in the years where it's cold and wet and the caterpillars aren't so available, maybe the females can't get enough fat on them to produce enough eggs. So it could be that the number of eggs is actually quite important in terms of the population. So ultimately we're devising ways to try and tease out the effects of both adult survival and how that varies geographically within the UK and productivity. But with the cuckoo, it's not like a dummy where we've got loads of data, so it's a bit more tricky to do.
Will the new trackers give an idea of how many eggs are being laid?
Yeah, no, I don't think we'll get that detailed information. It has to be very detailed to know when they're laying an egg. But what we'd like to do is, well, the first thing to do is no one really knows, is the migration of males different to females? Do females which exploit different hosts migrate differently? And does the range of behaviour in the UK of males and females vary depending upon local habitat conditions? So in China, I think it is, in Japan, it's been shown that sometimes they breed in one area, wetlands, when they're exploiting oriental reed borders, but they can fly 30 kilometres to feed and then back again because there's no suitable feeding sites for them nearer. And it may be that the habitat configuration here in the UK is quite important in determining where they feed them and the energetics of the cuckoos. So up in Scotland, in the Sussex, Southern Highlands, where we tagged some cuckoos, all of them went up 50 kilometres to the mains of Hewson, a big bog, where they fed up before migrating. So this sort of information, we could tell that because it was 50 kilometres, but I mean, it could be just a few kilometres. You can imagine it's dark where they are higher up into the hills to feed on emperor caterpillars, that sort of thing. Who knows? So we're going to find out a lot of information about habitat configurations, and then the idea is to try and relate that to how the birds do later on in the animal cycle.
I'm going to allow a quick question from Barry, who's eager up in the gallery. So the question from Barry is, why do males leave breeding grounds so early sometimes?
So, well, probably, I think it probably depends on the host. So, as I mentioned, big water has become more commonly used host. We know that cuckoos are still laying eggs in big waters nest into July. So probably the males, and we know also that birds which are migrating southwest might be somehow related to being big water cuckoos migrate later. So it's quite possible that in cases where there's an advantage to stay, they do stay. But obviously, when you've got early breeding birds like dunnocks and melophippus as the host, once they've impregnated the females can store sperm. I've asked this to get David to make sure they will go to store sperm for a while. So there's no need for them to be there. And we've shown that later migrating birds do less well, so they're more likely to die when they leave the UK. These birds feed on mostly, ideally, on large soft-bodied things. And as you can imagine, in southern Europe, further into the summer, it gets drier, and these things get harder to find. So migrating earlier is a good thing. We also showed that when they arrive south of the Sahara, it's got an impact on when they migrate northwards over the Sahara, when they migrate back to the UK. So they'll leave as early as they can. So that's the advantage, I think. It's basically better conditions in southern Europe, and then they probably get better conditions in Africa, so they migrate earlier.
Lovely. I don't know about you, but I'm just astonished about what we're finding out. I didn't see all this technology coming, and it's revolutionary, isn't it? It's astonishing. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Hewson. And before we break for lunchtime, I think that we've got a little, here comes Mark. Brilliant. So we've got a little session on volunteering.
Hi everybody. Wow, those are two fantastic talks. So just a very quick